Delighted to welcome two great speakers tonight. So we've got Scott Arthur, who is the lead councillor for transport at Edinburgh City Council. And I think it's not an over claim to say that Edinburgh just recently announced the boldest plans in Scotland for to reform transport in the city. I'm sure he's going to tell us all about it. And then our second speaker tonight is Glen MacDonald, who's Professor of Future Mobility at University of West England. And he's going to talk about ways to think differently about transport planning. And we're going to also try a little bit of a feedback via a Menti poll at the end of his talk. So we like to try and do things differently. So without further ado, we will start as we normally do with a little bit of a news roundup, which is always we open the floor to attendees to share anything that might have come up. We've all been, we haven't had the active travel for a couple of weeks, so I'm not sure if anyone's got any news to share. If so, now's the time to share it. So have you all been on holiday for 2 weeks and tuned out beautifully from the active travel world? Ruth?
It never rains, but it pours. So 2 activities today: the all-party parliamentary group for cycling and walking and cycling showcase event this morning, which was really good, well attended. Lots of MPs there of all colours and persuasions, and showcasing from Raleigh, who put money into it, which was very good. Bikeability were there and various other people. So that was very good. And then Green Alliance had an event about active travel or thinking of travel differently. Depressantly, the new chair of the Transport Committee, Ian somebody, Scottish fellow, kind of said there won't be anything new in active travel till after the elections. And by that, I think he meant the main elections. So that was a bit of a worry in terms of things like they're going to lose so much money from EVs and less petrol being sold. So he wasn't very promising to listen to, I have to say. But good events. That the Green Alliance one is worth watching. And Hira from Possible, who we've had on, spoke very well and very eloquently. So I can recommend people try and find it and watch it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Robin.
Unmute. Thanks. So I hope everyone watched Panorama last night, which was, I think, mixed. I have to say, Zuhura, who's well known to us, did one of the team did a really brilliant job. She put a lot of effort into that, coordinating people and speaking really eloquently. We appreciated that, and one of our lead councillors, Andrew Gant, was on there several times, being very diplomatic. You reach of major judgment. I can't add much to that. I think one thing that is important to know is since that it was made about 8 weeks ago, and since then the bollards have all been replaced with these sturdy wooden bollards, and despite a few vandalization attacks, they are all still in place 100%. One of them was taken out, was replaced within 24 hours. We think it just simply wasn't locked properly, and possibly even some students just whipped it off. But they are all in place. The streets are quiet, the streets are protected, and we are back in happy days, although still controversial days. And plenty more is happening in Oxford, but I will sort of render the floor to somebody else.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I know we heard from you relatively recently, but so much going on. Yeah, probably be good to have a longer update maybe at some point. Mark.
Yes, I've just been, so I'm standing for election in 2 weeks' time, and it's getting rather frantic, so I'm only going to be here for an hour and then I've got to go off and deliver things. And without getting into the politics side of things, it's amazing when you knock on the door, there's an LTN next door in Hanover, which is, or proposed LTN, and we're getting it very much in the neck. And some of those ridiculous comments that were on the Panorama last night, you hear on the doorstep and people just regurgitate it. And I have to restrain myself from trying to have a 20-minute discussion with every single conspiracy theory nutter that I encounter, trying to put them right. and realise that my time is best spent moving on to the other people. But it's just really worrying how far the penetration has got to people who haven't really heard much about anything, but just go, you know, they're just out to control us. They're going to stop us driving. And the full World Economic Forum, whatever it is, Economics Foundation, you know, starts with fines, and before you know it, there'll be armed guards on the street down the corner. These are perfectly reasonable looking people when you knock on their door. So it's really quite worrying. It's not a majority, by the way, but it's enough to make it worrying.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go Bob and then Simon, but just a bit of a plug for a future session on the 2nd of May. We've got Stefan Rolnick coming on, who's an expert on misinformation. So because of all the stuff that has been going on lately with 15-minute neighbourhoods, and so might want to keep that date in your diary if you're interested in that topic. Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Simon Monk that when people are actually in with the conspiracy theory, there's no point engaging with them. I mean, I appreciate when you're on the doorstep, you can't say, oh, fuck off, you are a stupid whatever. You know, you present your case. I think you should present the case. And if you're getting all this nonsense, then don't bother engaging. I didn't see the panorama. I saw the BBC One News thing. I tend to agree with Carlton Reid that it was a good balance. So you have the kind of sane, polite people who want cleaner air, and then you have Lawrence Fox on the other. So it's a kind of balance like that, and it sort of, I think, probably works in our favour. But it comes back to the whole thing about how the BBC should be objective, not balancing out the loonies with the people who are sensible, and should spend time looking at what the reasons for LTMs are, even if it isn't very sexy. It's the old thing that if one person says it's raining and the other person says it's not raining, you don't balance them up. You go outside to find out if it is raining. Okay, that's
it. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, that was an actual line from the BBC editorial guidelines, but often they don't seem to follow that. Simon.
Just a piece of advice for Mark and everyone else involved in this kind of world, to follow on from Bob's point and Mark's point, which is just don't assume that the people that you speak to on the doorstep are in any way a representative slice of local residents. They're the people who open the door and then don't look at you going, hi, I'm here from and don't just go, shut door immediately or peek from behind curtains, etc. Over and over again, we saw that what looks like, when we've been doing leafleting and door-to-door in various bits of Walter Forest for various schemes, what initially looks like really, really polarized opinions is actually just the people who bothered to open the door. And the vast bulk of people, when you actually meet them and find them and get hold of them, they're like, is there a scheme? What, it's at the end of my road? There's a scheme at the end of my road? I didn't even realise. Oh, it's those big plantery things. That's their kind of attitude. So actually, don't assume all the way around, and don't get drawn into these kind of fights if you can at all avoid them. They are utterly pointless.
Simon, that's not quite true for politics. I would say 90% of people, 95% of people open the door. They might not be nice, they might not want to have time, but they do open the door. They might then tell you to go away, but they don't hide.
Go look at the tally sheet.
Chaps, carry on.
Yeah, some of the time anyway.
Do feel free to discuss in the chat. Madeline, we'll make this the last news contribution. Madeline.
Okay, it was just to say two things. One of them is in Newport in South Wales. They've just opened a very flashy new active travel bridge which crosses over the railway line, which kind of cut up half the city from getting to the city centre. You can't actually cycle through the city centre, so we'll see how that works, but you can definitely walk a smoother way now. And the other thing is they're just starting a behaviour change department in the public sector organisation called Newport Live, which is sports and culture, and they have 4 posts open to do with active travel and behaviour change if anybody's looking for a job in South Wales. They look really exciting. One of the things they're doing, I just wanted to say, was really interesting to try and convince people to that maybe cycling to work is a practical option, is they have a bike with some sort of Zwift thing on the front there where you can use Google Street View to cycle from your house to your workplace and see that actually, oh, it only took 15 minutes and I didn't break a sweat or whatever it is. So I just thought they are coming up with some quite innovative things to change the attitudes and behaviours. Whether the infrastructure catches up with that is a different question.
Yeah, sequencing is important. Madeline, if you've got the links to those, it'd be great to put them in the chat, the jobs and that example you mentioned. Okay, right. Well, I'm going to keep the news section short tonight and get into our speakers. So without further ado, could I invite Scott to come to the floor? So yeah, Scott is Transport Convener for Edinburgh City Council, and over to you, Scott.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So very briefly, what a Transport Convener in Edinburgh is just a councillor who's been nominated by his peers or her peers to be the chair of the committee. So it's a political position rather than a technical one or a bureaucratic one. And just reflecting on the conversation there, over the last 5 years in Edinburgh, the kind of public discourse about transport in Edinburgh, it got bogged down into an endless argument about cars versus bikes, and which I found just to be completely intractable, and no one was ever going to agree about anything. And so one of the things I did early on was try to move that on and talk much more about walking and also public transport as well, because I don't think it suits anybody who's serious about changing transport just to talk about cars versus bikes all the time. Although obviously in terms of space, that is often the big challenge we face, but I think it's better to talk about the whole system. Okay, so I became Transport Convener 10 months or so ago, and one of the first things I did was I launched our LEZ, Low Emission Zone, here in Edinburgh. And why I talk about that is it's a reminder that whilst I'm new to the job, there has been a lot of certainly change in terms of planning made in Edinburgh over the last few years, and I'm just the latest person in that position. And I think probably the last 10 years there's been a lot of movement in this area of Edinburgh, but we're getting to the stage now where we're moving from planning, hopefully, to delivery. So there is quite a lot of uncertainty in transport in Edinburgh and elsewhere just now. We're still really trying to come to terms with what it means post-pandemic. Our public transport uptake's about 85% of what it was post-pandemic, which is still quite concerning for me. We're a growing city. We set aside land to grow the city by about 10% or so over the next 10 years. So that's 37,000 houses, which is actually mind-boggling. An equal city in terms of income, and also the impact that has on the ability of people to move around the city, and also through disability, etc. as well. There's transport barriers there as well. Economic shocks to deal with, Brexit, Ukraine, pandemic. These are all important, and we have to think about how we get through this, move the city on, and also attract investment, which is important. And when I speak to developers, they're interested in the transport infrastructure around their development, but they're also keen to hear about the wider vision, because if you're spending tens of millions of pounds developing an office space in Edinburgh, you want to know what kind of city your employees are going to be living in. And so often that wider piece is quite important to them, because that's absolutely fundamental to well-being, etc. The challenges, though, are kind of linked to that, I guess, is that we have to get the tension right. We have to get the balance right between getting the basics right, filling potholes, and showing ambition to take the city forward. We have to get it ready for the future. We've committed to reducing vehicle miles in the city by 30% by 2030, hitting net zero, dealing with that housing growth, etc. These are all big challenges we face in Edinburgh. Five-dimensional party politics in Edinburgh. So in Edinburgh, we have 63 councillors. They're all in one of 5 different parties, and all those parties are roughly the same size. So really, to get anything across the line, you need 3 parties to agree, and you can imagine how difficult that is. And so we're actually, I'll mention my political party here. I'm a Labour Party councillor here in Edinburgh. So Labour last May became a minority administration in Edinburgh. So we've got 13 out of, well, we had 13 out of 63 councillors, and it's our job to try and reach consensus, which is quite difficult sometimes. And to make matters worse, one of my Labour colleagues decided to go independent. So there's now only 12 of us, which makes it even harder. Chronic underfunding, local authorities, in England there'll be, and elsewhere in the UK will be used to this, but it's exactly the same in Scotland. Local authorities are underfunded, and by chronic I mean long term. Now, active transport's different in this respect, in that the Scottish Government has ring-fenced money in the past and continues to do so for active transport. So if, as a council, if we want to do something like, a major junction, improve safety at it, the easiest way to do that is to link it to active transport improvements, and then we can access cash from the Scottish Government directly to do that. So that's the way, in a kind of crude way, that's it. That's the way it works in Edinburgh. And most of our funding for active travel, the bigger projects, comes to us from the Scottish Government via Sustrans in Scotland, who manage most of these projects, which comes with its challenges, to be honest. But thankfully, we've got a really good working relationship with Sustrans, and they understand our challenges and also our ambition. And we've worked with them for some time, so we've got some understanding of them as well. And lastly, change is painful. And what I mean by that is when we install these projects, the actual construction process can be hugely disruptive in a city like Edinburgh, which has quite a lot of narrow streets. And in the last year, that's something I've really come to understand, is that whilst these schemes are absolutely desirable, sometimes delivering them on the ground can be really painful for communities and businesses. And that's where the consultation piece really comes in really strongly. So I'll talk you through some of the stuff we're doing and hopefully give you a flavour and maybe stimulate some questions. So this is a street right in the city centre of Edinburgh, and what we're going to do, it's George Street, and just now it looks like this. It's just a giant car park. I get in trouble for calling it that, but we're going to take all those cars out and make the focus on the place. So about, it's a cycling route right through the centre of it, but also a place where people can come, hang around, meet friends, sit on benches, take advantage of bars, restaurants, and there's some quite good shops here. So economic development, transport, well-being, all in the same place. Right in the heart of the city centre of Edinburgh, and the most controversial point is not should we do this or not, but should we have trees or not, because trees interrupt the fantastic views you get along this street. And that's how it was originally designed to maintain these views. So we've actually got a 2-hour workshop tomorrow lined up to talk about whether or not we should have trees. And if we do have trees, how big should they be? So this is a transformative project. So we've got the workshop tomorrow to shape it. It'll go live hopefully next year. But then on Thursday, we've got other projects we'll be taking forward to design stage for this kind of approach, where we're going to pedestrianise or reduce car penetration into the city centre to try and transform it and make the city centre a much better place to be if you're walking, wheeling or cycling or accessing it via public transport. Across the city, we're installing low traffic neighbourhoods, although we're not going to call them low traffic neighbourhoods anymore because that's quite a controversial term. But we'll do exactly the same stuff, but we'll probably package it a different way and something that works well for Edinburgh. And we're also rolling out 20-minute neighbourhoods as well. And this is the outline of one for an area just outside the city centre. And these schemes, obviously there is people resistant to them, and lots of them seem to be watching Panorama last night, because I had messages this morning saying that I should watch it, and if I want to know what's going to be coming to Edinburgh, etc. But this is part of the change we're going through as a city, without a doubt. We've just delivered, we're just about to deliver a tramline extension in Edinburgh, big infrastructure project, which builds on the existing tramline, which wasn't a great project in terms of how it was managed, but the actual line is fantastic. So this extension is really important because the councils delivered this extension themselves with their own funding, and despite COVID and Ukraine and Brexit, we're going to deliver it on time and on budget. And that shows to the Scottish Government that we can deliver these big projects, it's quite good. And it also means that the public starts to trust us again around these big projects. So really important project. So pretty soon before the summer, we'll consult on extending the tram lines. The solid line is what should be running by June. The dotted lines in terms of trams is what we're going to consult on. probably £1.3 billion extension to the network, delivered, well, hopefully complete by 2035. Excruciatingly slow it feels, but that's the target we've set ourselves. On top of that, Edinburgh has a fantastic bus service. We're really recently rated 13th in the world in terms of public transport, best in Scotland, second in the UK. We're working with Lothian Buses. I was just off the phone with them there, actually just before this meeting started, working with Lothian Buses to further develop this network. What's unusual about in the UK context, certainly a Scottish context, is that both the bus network and the tram network in Edinburgh is publicly owned. And so we have a fantastic working relationship with our partners in Lothian Buses and Edinburgh Trams, and we really do get the social dividend from operating a publicly owned bus service, although it has commercial independence. What we've just started consulting on yesterday is a citywide cycle network. So this will change everything in Edinburgh, delivered over the next 10 years or so. So just to put this in scale, our active travel action plan, it's called, is probably a package of measures for both walking and cycling of around £1 billion over the next 10 years. It's £250 million walking alone, £250 million cycling alone, and then 500 walking and cycling schemes together. Nice big round numbers, it means I don't forget them. And so this will be transformative. And you know, right at the start, it was mentioned that this was the biggest plan in Scotland. I don't know any other city in Europe that's saying it's going to spend £1 billion in active travel over the next 10 years. And coupled with, I think, what we're doing with public transport, I think it really is going to change Edinburgh. So the other day, we were, like I said, 13th in the world for public transport. I think our aim, I just made this up today actually at a meeting, in 10 years' time, I think we want to be in the top 5 in Europe in terms of sustainable transport. And so that's our aim, but goodness knows what that means. But this is a big investment for us. And why it's important to have these plans, this 10-year plan, is because of the way the funding works in Scotland. So we have plans which are well developed, then that gives the Scottish Government confidence to give a hand over the cash for us to start taking these forward. And that's really the focus of these plans. Over up to 2026, I think currently we're scheduled to deliver around £120 million worth of active travel projects. But with these plans, that becomes a minimum of £120 million. And hopefully this will grow and grow over the next 5 years or so. Hopefully we'll see a lot of real change. This all fits within what we call a circulation plan. So we're currently looking at all the key routes in the city, what that means in terms of, bus priority, active travel priority, general traffic, goods and services. And this is kind of the blueprint for how we'll take the city forward. Part of the thinking here is you can see that a lot of these routes are encapsulating developments. And part of the thinking that these encapsulations will be the starting point for some of the LTNs that we want to take forward, or 20-minute neighbourhoods we want to take forward. We call them 20-minute neighbourhoods. I noticed you were calling them 15-minute neighbourhoods earlier. Maybe we've got an extra 5 minutes up here because we'll walk a bit slower. I don't know. It's a hilly city. Maybe that's it, an extra 5 minutes for that. So this is the plan, and this will be hopefully transformative. Obviously, we've just started consultation on this, 3-month consultation, with residents and businesses. But what we're not, it's worth labouring this point actually, is that as a council we've agreed to reduce traffic volumes by 30%. We've agreed to hit net zero. So we've agreed to do these things, and we've agreed to cut congestion. So what we're consulting on is how we're going to do that. And so what I say in the consultation is that you might not like this plan for how we're going to cut congestion and reduce traffic volumes by 30%. But if you don't like it, you have to tell us what your alternative is. Doing nothing is no longer an option. In Edinburgh, over the last, I think, 10 years or so, traffic volumes have grown by 100 million miles per year, which is quite a lot in an Edinburgh context, and that just can't be repeated. So no conclusion slides, but what I want to talk about is opportunities. I'm getting to wrapping up. This is my last slide really. Is that for us, working with businesses has been really important, and I don't think that happened enough in the last administration. I think showing people that there's economic benefits to this and getting businesses on side, I think helps calm people down. And a lot of the LTN debate I see south of the border is about the impact on business, etc. So working with business is absolutely key. The other thing we've done is we've we're setting up an accessibility commission. And so that's all the charities involved, RNIB, Guide Dogs Scotland, etc. And they're getting a say on how these plans develop as well, because that's something else that gets used against what we're trying to do, is that blue badge holders, etc. are going to be excluded. So working with businesses and people with mobility problems, etc. is absolutely the heart of this. Of course, boundary work's important because a lot of the traffic problems we have in Edinburgh are coming from surrounding local authorities. And the last point, contributing to national progress is important because that's where our funding comes from. We have to align what we're doing in the city with those national priorities. And if we tick those boxes, then we start to get funding for these projects. So there's a lot in that, and I feel like I've rushed through it, but hopefully it's given you some idea of what we're up to here in Edinburgh. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think you've done it justice, and bang on 5:30 as well. So good timing. I'll kick us off with a couple of questions. If we pop the slides down now, so we can see you again. There we go. I'll just put you on. I've lost you for a moment. So yeah, my first question. I think you spoke to it in your chat, but in your presentation, but the fact that ultimately you're taking on everything in a one-er, it's public transport, it's parking, it's active travel, it's cycle lanes, it's everything, which I think is one of the things that's so compelling about it, because maybe you can't do things on their own because you need the public transport to provide alternatives to cars, etc. How do you feel about that? Do you kind of worry, are we taking on too much, or do you think this is the only way to do it?
So I'm only concerned about what we're doing is how we fit, basically £3 billion investment in transport and public and active transport in Edinburgh over a 10-year period without the city just becoming a giant site of roadworks. That's my only concern. But when I look at this, for our key arterial routes where we're wanting to improve public transport connections, so we're doing a lot on arterial routes just now in terms of planning, where we're going to give more bus lanes, more bus priorities. So we're giving the bus drivers control of the traffic lights, etc. We're doing all this stuff, and this involves a lot of spend along these routes. Managing parking, I almost said removing there, and managing loading along these routes as well. And it makes absolute sense to look at active travel at the same time. So why double dig? Why go in 1 year to get the public transport right, and then a couple of years later to get active transport right? Let's get it right first time. Let's do it all together. If we can get the funding aligned, it's not as easy as it sounds. But yeah, so that's what we're about, particularly for these key arterial routes. And Edinburgh's a very much a hub and spoke city where we have a city centre and we have these routes going out to the rim, if I could use that word, and that's the ring road that goes around the city, which has been there for about 30 years or so.
And a couple of questions in the chat that sort of related, and I was going to ask about this, which is how much work has it been to kind of get to this point in terms of lining up the sort of political will and other key stakeholders? What's been the key to getting the city and the political group ready to take on a challenge like this?
So it has been 10 years of planning, so two predecessors ago that, plans were spoken about doing this, but nothing really happened with those plans. Then the last administration, my predecessor, there was a new, we called it City Mobility Plan, which is kind of the internal phrase we use for this, but the public don't really, it's not a phrase the public would use. So that was restarted in 2017. got the plan together, was approved in 2018. So it was quite general, though, about improving public transport, making it easier city, more equal, etc. But what's happened since then is I think the way that the Scottish Government has focused funding on active travel has meant me being able to take advantage of that and take these projects forward. But to be fair, though, if I was a member of the active travel, lobby community here in Edinburgh, they'd be probably quite frustrated about the rate of change. But I'm quite optimistic about what we can do going forward. We've got projects live just now. We've got ones that are in the pipeline, which will go live over the next year or two. So we're getting to the stage where we're going to have a real conveyor belt of projects, where teams can work on one project, design, goes to completion, and then they can move straight over to the next project. So we've got continuity, and we're also thinking quite seriously about how we build up expertise within the council, so we're not always relying on consultants. So all this is coming together just now, and it feels quite good. But we are heavily reliant on this money from the Scottish Government, which, if not have been watching the news, the politics in Scotland just now looks a little bit fragile. But I'm hopeful that coming through this, that funding stream will continue for both the public and active travel element.
And one of the sort of subsidiary questions to that was about, in terms of persuading councillors that this is a good thing to do, particularly the active travel part. What would your advice be, particularly as we talk about the Panorama programme and talk about how much opposition there is? What's your advice to people trying to convince local councillors that taking on these kind of challenges is the right thing to do?
The thing that gets weaponized against us is the business impact and the impact on people who are disabled. And often the people who use these arguments against us have no connections with either of these communities. I mean, for the George Street example, which I showed you, I met a major, like an international consultancy who's based in that street with offices last week. And I said it was fantastic that they were so on board with it. I said that publicly. And someone said to me, "Oh, but you never asked the businesses who are against the scheme on the street." And I challenged that person to name a business that was against that, and he couldn't. And in fact, yesterday I asked the team, was there any businesses on the street who were against it, and they couldn't name one either. So why I'm telling you that is I think it's really important to get businesses on side and be able to say to people, look, we're doing this because it's right for transport, it's right to keep people active, it's right for net zero, it's right for congestion, and there's going to be an economic benefit. And the same, and likewise around the people with disabilities. I mean, George Street just now, people do say, oh, this is going to be terrible for people with disabilities because they can no longer park their car there. There's going to be more blue badge spaces than there is just now. And actually, George Street has an horrendous environment just now with people with some disabilities, and this is going to make it better. So I think tackling those two, the weaponization, and I hate using that phrase, of business impact and also impact on the disability community is absolutely key to getting us across the line. I mean, to be fair to the 63 councillors, not all of them absolutely 100% back these plans, but either do I. I have some concerns about some of what we're doing in terms of, how we're going to get it right. But I think normally what the opposition does to the plans does is, in political opposition, is rather than say they're outright against it, they ask for more evidence. And so that's and I feel that's just kind of delaying tactic. There's never going to be enough evidence for some people. They're just always going to be wanting more. So I'm pleased that it's come down to that rather than people being just straightforward against it. So yeah, I'm rambling. So getting
I think
an argument around business and impact on people with disabilities and getting it right and doing it in a serious way, not a cynical way, So for George Street, I mean, this project has been going on for a couple of years before it became convener. Some businesses in George Street had never been spoken to by anybody in elected office in the council. And I was really surprised by that when I went along. And I think that's really important. And that's what I'm doing tomorrow. I'm meeting businesses tomorrow, and I'm going along to listen to them. I'm not going along to tell them what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about trees.
Well, we might have time for two more, because I wouldn't want to make trees the final one, but there's been a lot of chat about trees in the chat. And I think that's partly related to the point about people with disabilities. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You've got this huge bold vision, and then it's the literally the small tree roots that might trip you up. Where will you? What's the key to navigating that one, do you think?
Well, the tree thing really comes down to it's not so around about the tree roots, because we can manage that. It's around shade. So the original vision from the architect, back in the 1800s, whose name I forget, was it was going to be a boulevard, and you could see the buildings each end, any spot on that road, and that was the vision. And so it's part of our World Heritage Site, and people who understand this stuff, they say this is absolutely key to maintaining the World Heritage Site. But when we originally published the plans, there was lots of people saying that this scheme would never work because Edinburgh's too cold and people aren't going to be spending time outside, etc. Edinburgh's a great city, it's sunny just now. But then slowly, and again it's on social media, this narrative built about how it was going to be too hot on the street without any trees. There's no trees there just now. There's one tree actually, I lied there. And how trees were key to cooling the space. And so as this came to committee for their decision the last time, this was the big question about whether or not there's enough trees for cooling. And this was linked to climate change, etc. Even though we have a plan to plant 1 million trees in the city, the 16 trees on the street, almost it was like it was going to be a tipping point around climate change, whether or not we have trees on the street. So it was, in a way, it's been quite frustrating. But in another way, I'm grateful for that as being the controversial thing, and we're not talking about, parking, which is.
Thank you. And I haven't got any hands up. There's been quite a few questions in the chat, and I'll ask one of them now, and then my last question, and then we'll move on to our final speaker. But the one question in the chat was, do you see park and ride fitting in at all? Does that have any place in your future plans?
Yeah, so Edinburgh already has park and ride, and they work relatively well, and we are looking at expanding them. One of the things we're doing is we're actually going to place a park and ride outside our local authority area to try to absorb some of the traffic coming into Edinburgh. We're also looking, and I shouldn't say this too loudly, we're looking at the park and ride sites as doing other things. So we're thinking, can we combine a park and ride site with, as an existing supermarket, say, EV charging, our buses, because the decarbonisation of our bus fleet, we've got the council's bus company owns about 700 or 800 buses. We're also looking at using park and rides for charging facilities for them, and so it's all this comes together. So we're massively expanding bus capacity, hopefully on these arterial networks, but through giving buses more priority, massively doing that. And park and rides are part of that. But the other thing that's part of that is that over the next 2 years or so, a lot of this capacity is going to come online in terms of public transport, arterial routes from surrounding local authorities. If people don't take up on that, we'll look at congestion charging as well, and that'll hopefully encourage them a little bit more to use the bus.
And that was going to be my last question, so we'll make this the last one before we move on to Glen, which is about, I guess, the sort of funding and powers. And I've read your quotes in the BBC News story saying that, if in a couple of years the levels aren't moving the way that you want them, that you will look at a congestion charge and use that money to fund even better public transport. Do you already have, does Edinburgh as a city already have the powers and the budget that it needs, or have you got to kind of go into bat to get those, notwithstanding, as you said, the kind of current SNP difficulties?
So there's two powers we have. Just it's transport. Well, there's revenue raising powers for local authorities in Scotland are difficult, but one of the things is not transport related, but there will be transport benefits, and that's having a tourist tax in Edinburgh. I think, is it Manchester just introduced one? So that will come with some city centre. If we get that power, we've been promised it for some time, but it's never arrived yet. If we get that power, there will be some transport benefits in the city centre. The other two powers we have, and I think we can do this, but we still need permission from the Scottish Government to progress the detail, is a workplace parking levy, so similar to Nottingham. Politically, that's difficult though, and I wouldn't like to predict what's going to happen with that. And with that, the council will consult on that after the summertime. And the other one we have is congestion charge. So I think we have the power to take that forward, but we would have to seek permission from the Scottish Government on the final plan. So yeah, I mean, so these things are all there. I mean, my big uncertainty is about the bus priority measures in surrounding local authorities, whether people will take them up or not. And so congestion charge, I think, is looking more likely than not, I think, because of that. Maybe I'm just being too pessimistic. Being Scottish, I'm naturally pessimistic. But if people don't take up that, it may become necessary to use the congestion charge, which comes with its own problems as well, to be honest, about where you draw the boundary. It's impossible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And I think the consultation running for a couple of months now. So yeah, I look forward to how that goes and love to have you back on and see how the progress goes. I think it's really exciting what Edinburgh are doing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you as well. Thank you.
Okay, so without further ado, let's move on to our second speaker. And thank you, Glen, for waiting. I hope you found some of that interesting as well. So over to you, Glen.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, really inspiring, Scott. A privilege to follow on from that. And I guess I'm taking a bigger picture strategic view on how we plan, which of course sets the context for walking and cycling prospects over the years and decade ahead. You're all familiar with predict and provide. Of course, it brings up all the connotations of the incumbent regime, the way the world has been in planning terms. Nearly 10 years ago, I was seconded to the New Zealand Ministry of Transport, partly to address a very difficult question, which was why on earth has road traffic stopped growing for several years when it always grew, and we always invested in more roads to fulfill the projected demand that was coming from the forecasters. So what I'm wanting to share with you very briefly today is the alternate decide and provide paradigm, which we developed in New Zealand. And I suppose I spent the last decade nearly as a proponent of that and trying to encourage its adoption in the UK and elsewhere. So I've called this a diffusing innovation in a climate emergency. And I think that's the point about change. In the same way as I don't believe in revolution in the transport system, whether it's technological or otherwise, we're not likely to see revolution in the transport planning profession, and yet we can look to see a fundamental transition in how we plan and why over time. So let me move on through. And cast your minds back to last July. You know, it's a stark reminder that circumstances are really changing around us in quite profound ways. And it might sound like this is the academic in me coming through now, but I really believe in failing to plan. It's planning to fail. But if you step back even further, I think failing to think about how and why we're planning is also potentially in this context planning to fail. And so we do need to get philosophical, if I dare say it. And I'm not saying that in an academic way, but in a very practical way to set the right foundations for how we plan. But, you know, just going back to basics, looking in the rearview mirror, this might be an extreme example, but, you know, looking at that image, Los Angeles Thanksgiving, you have to say, if that's the answer, what the hell was the question? And I guess it was probably, how do we get people from A to B? But, you know, without patronising you, we know travel is a derived demand. And the point is, it's always been about access, stupid. And that means transport problems don't only need transport solutions. Now, maybe this seems obvious to all of us, but it certainly hasn't seemed so obvious in the way we've conducted ourselves as a profession over the last few decades. So to the proposition, I suppose, that we might be facing what I would call a regime transition between paradigms in transport planning. Now, I hasten to say this is a very simplified black and white compare and contrast that I've got on the slide for you. But if I can just introduce decide and provide at a very high level and contrast it with predict and provide. So in the predict and provide paradigm, we would be forecasting a most likely mobility future. So in contrast, decide and provide is about deciding, perhaps in the way that we just heard from Scott, on a preferred accessibility future, distinction between mobility and accessibility. Predict and provide is very much about demand-led supply, but if you flip that around, it's quite a fundamental change to supply-led demand. Predict and provide conceals uncertainty, typically. That's how it's been perceived for sure. Meanwhile, decide and provide, as well as being vision-led, is also about accommodating the uncertainty that Scott referred to. And so we can suggest that predict and provide is a reactive planning approach, whereas decide and provide is inherently more proactive. Now, this was a theoretical proposition nearly 10 years ago. So the question perhaps on your minds is, well, yes, but what about in practice? Well, I do believe this is an example of the diffusion of innovation. And as you're perhaps familiar, what this means is we've got the initial innovators, the small, ambitious, brave early movers, before you then start to move into the phase of early adopters and then an early majority. And eventually, perhaps, you really have seen a complete transition where this has become the new norm and established paradigm. So you've got some examples across the top of the screen there. First of all, in my role with Mark McDonald and UWE, we developed a practical toolkit for how to be able to implement decide and provide. This was then taken up by the TRIX consortium, which very much swung it into the sphere of local planning and local transport planning. We've seen examples with strategic subnational transport bodies, and indeed very pleased to be in the company of Scott and Scotland. So the National Transport Strategy in Scotland, when it was revised, was on the basis of a decide and provide approach. That's gone up to an International Transport Forum level. So it's of international concern and in turn interest to see this change in the way we plan. And perhaps most pleasingly and most recently, only a few months ago, we saw Oxfordshire County Council formally adopt at Cabinet decide and provide principles in place of predict and provide. I don't have time to go into all the detail, but in a sense, one can view predict and provide as being a regime compliant mindset or philosophy in relation to planning. Meanwhile, what we were putting forward with decide and provide was what we called a regime testing philosophy, and saying, well, we should be looking at preferred outlooks. We should be recognizing it was always about access, stupid. It's access economy coupling, not transport economy coupling. We've had weak planning for too long. We need stronger planning. I think Edinburgh's illustrated that very well this afternoon. It's about exposing the uncertainty that we're now confronted with, not concealing it, and so on. You can see the contrast. And I'm not suggesting it's as simple as one or the other, but position yourself somewhere across that spectrum. And just one or two real headlight examples I would suggest. Again, last year, Scotland, having identified its commitment, having decided, I should say, on a 20% reduction in total car kilometres in the next 7 years, has then provided a route map for achieving that preferred future. And then zooming in at a more local strategic planning level to Oxfordshire, as I've mentioned, again in the context of the climate emergency, perhaps the real impetus that we were lacking before to have stronger planning that's vision-led rather than forecast-led. But let's be under no illusions. When you're seeing a regime transition or a diffusion of innovation, old regimes don't go quietly. The incumbents are strongly embedded, and there can be a lot of inertia surrounding them. So I really have zoomed out away from active travel here to look at the recently published draft national policy statement for national networks. Quite a dry sounding document, quite a dry document. But this is what will guide secretaries of state on decisions around nationally significant infrastructure projects. I found myself reviewing the document and critiquing it. Some of you may have seen this in the latest issue of Local Transport Today, because I came to the conclusion that predict and provide lives on in looking at that document, which was rather worrying. And within that mindset, I think, is this incredible degree of false precision that we've allowed to exist in transport planning for so long. You can see the example front and centre from the document itself. So looking over a 35-year period into an uncertain future, this document was quite happily talking about how reductions or changes, rather, increases in numbers of seconds of lost time due to congestion on motorways could range from 81.8% to 215.5%. I mean, what on earth are we doing imagining that that's of any value whatsoever to have that level of false precision? So I would really encourage us in our philosophy on transport planning to embrace the fact that it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And when it comes to making the case at public inquiry, we really have to bear in mind that evidence is not synonymous with truth once we look to the future rather than to the past. Now, I've mentioned access, and something that really has come to the fore as part of this paradigm, thanks to the pandemic, is the notion that we set out which we called the triple access system. And in turn, we've been advocating that we really now need to move from transport planning to what we call triple access planning. So at the heart of this is that we've relied heavily on physical mobility through the transport system to gain access to people, goods, employment, services and opportunities. But also, of course, spatial proximity can play its part in enabling active travel as another means of gaining access. And now, if you like, the third leg of the triple access stool comes in the form of the rapidly mature telecommunication system providing digital connectivity. So let's just briefly consider pre-COVID. One might imagine this was conceptually what reflected reality, a high degree of reliance on the transport system for access. As the pandemic came upon us and lockdowns were enforced and so on, what we saw was a rapid adaptation of human behaviour within this triple access system to see a greater reliance on living local and acting global. The question is, whilst we've seen a demonstration of our adaptability as humans and the resilience of this system, is what shape that triple access system should have in future. And that's where strong planning comes into play. Now, of course, it doesn't make it easy to determine what should be the future of a city or an urban or other rural areas in terms of that triple access mix. But we can start to piece together, if you like, a little bit of a Frankenstein's monster here of three elements we've seen quite recently, where taking the three elements of triple access, so physical mobility, I would flag the National Transport Strategy in Scotland, digital connectivity, Welsh Government, and then jump across to Paris in terms of the 15-minute city. In practical terms, we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, set out and made available in the public domain a 6-stage strategic planning approach, which allows people to put into practice this decide and provide way of doing triple access planning. And I would just end by moving south of the border from Scotland back to England. We're being told repeatedly that the new local transport planning guidance from DfT is imminent, and in turn that will release a whole slew of new local transport plans being developed in areas around the country that have declared climate emergencies and in turn have set themselves targets equivalent to the 30% mentioned by Scott for Edinburgh. And to me, we're really entering the last chance saloon now in relation to a climate emergency with this next round of local transport plans. And it seems to me imperative that we embrace this with a different mindset in transport planning terms. So I'm really looking forward to seeing an acceleration of this diffusion of innovation over the months ahead. And as an aside, if anyone's interested, we have developed a serious game as part of a project called Triple Access Planning for Uncertain Futures, which allows authorities with their staff to explore the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of this approach to transport, or should I say, access planning. With that, Roxy and Claire, if it's possible to flag for people this Mentimeter link, which I know is a bit of an experiment, the Active Travel Cafe this evening. I'd really be interested, don't pull your punches, just a couple of words that express your reaction to this decide and provide proposition for how we might be approaching the next generation of local transport planning. With that, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Glenn. And I think those two talks went really well together, because ultimately I think what Edinburgh are doing is an example of decide and provide. I think you said that, would you agree?
It certainly, as I was listening to Scott, I mean, of course I'd be interested in Scott's view himself, absolutely on the vision-led front. I think the other aspect, and then I think supply-led demand, this is about saying we believe that massive changes to infrastructure provision, prioritising walking and cycling will lead to demand changes rather than the other way around. I'm not sure how to what extent Edinburgh is grappling with the uncertainty side of all of this.
Yeah, Scott, if you're, I can't see the participants at the moment, but if you are still on the call and would like to come in, then do make yourself known.
I'll happily stop sharing. I was just wondering briefly, Claire, whether there was anyone that was wanting to perhaps throw in one or two challenges there. I'm intrigued perhaps with the outdated one. It'd be useful to hear any further thoughts on that, or discriminatory. So there are some warts to go with the proposition, I guess.
Yeah. Bob, I'll bring you in a sec. I guess from a real beginner's basic point of view, I just wanted to kind of ask if predict and provide is here, is predict and provide still the standard way that transport planning happens in this country?
I think we're in transition, so you will find, particularly I think in terms of the mindset of some authorities and some professionals, it's quite clear that it's hard to let go of the idea that we have models and we have the capacity to look forwards. We now have a DFT approach, which does try to embrace uncertainty in a set of scenarios, providing national road traffic projections. And yet, with the national policy statement, very quickly it's reverting to the core scenario or the reference scenario, and almost implicitly you're seeing a slippage back into, well, if that's the future demand and we want economic growth, then it implies we're going to need more infrastructure, doesn't it? So, but couple that with the example we've just heard from Scott, I think there are more and more innovators or early adopters who are recognising we've got license now to be vision-led rather than forecast-led, because we have the climate crisis, we've declared an emergency, we're not the only ones, we're not sticking our necks above the parapet as far as it might have felt 5 years ago.
Can I just very briefly chip in there? I really have to go.
Please.
I'll just make a quick comment and I'll rush out the door. Well, I've got another Zoom meeting, so I won't be rushing out the door. What I would say is, in terms of what we're doing to predict future, traffic demand, is we're now, well, on Thursday we'll start work remodelling. We'll get approval at the committee to remodel the 10 most dangerous junctions in Edinburgh. And that's what we're going to do, is just redesign those junctions based on the 30% traffic reduction in the future. So we're going to build in that future level, hopefully, of traffic we're expecting through it. But there is, so we do have, with the buses, when I was talking about bus provision and bus capacity, that's almost, build it and they will come type approach. But like I say, I am concerned that carrot won't work and perhaps some stick would be needed. Another reflection around the build it and they will come model is what we did during COVID, during the last administration, is we did install quite a lot of cycle lanes, for Edinburgh. I think it was maybe 33 kilometres of cycle lanes were installed. Obviously, that's double counting because it's on both sides of the roads. But I would think some of the data has shown actually the uptake of that's not good. And the reason for that is that a lot of it wasn't connected to anything. So it got people from part of their journey, but it left them marooned when it came to getting through, tricky, busier places. So it's just not been the attractor that we expected. And so one of the things we're doing now is looking at, well, if we're keeping these, which I think it looks like we're currently consulting on keeping them, is how do we connect them up to something to kind of amplify the benefits we get from it. So yeah, build it and they will come, but you have to build it well and it has to be connected to something. Right, so apologies, I'll have to go. I'm in trouble, I'm late already.
Thanks so much, Scott. And yeah, I think the decide and provide approach seems to essentially be, I think it was, when Henry Ford was developing the car in the 1900s, he basically said, if you ask people how they want to get around, they'd say they wanted a faster horse before cars were invented. So predict and provide seems the kind of equivalent of that, which is basically, let's measure what's currently happening and plan our future based on that, which does seem crazy when we know how much has to change. Bob, do you want to come in?
Yeah, basically supporting everything that's been said. Actually, I think John Whitelade referred to this approach as backcasting, that instead of forecasting, you say what you want in terms of modal share, and then you work backwards to get it. And actually, there are some good things in London. The Mayor's transport strategy does have, the by 2030 modal shares that are wanted. So that's good. There is actually a kind of funny intellectual argument that you can get to where you need to be using predict and provide, because you just come in and you say, we're going to quadruple the cost of petrol. We predict, therefore, there will be a decline, and then you work accordingly. But that's a kind of like mental gymnastics. But anyway, yeah, great stuff. All the best for it.
Yeah, just to briefly comment on the backcasting. Typically, with backcasting, it doesn't address the uncertainty. So I think it's
All right.
it's the sort of twin-pronged element of decide and provide, which is saying this is where we would like to be in the future. This is our preferred future. But a bit like setting sail in your ship towards that port, if it's stormy, choppy waters, which is the uncertainty, you've got to be able to navigate that in order to get where you need to go. And this is really about then saying, well, we can't say with certainty that that will be the future level of demand. We need to consider how different policy measures that we believe can help us move towards that port, towards that vision, will fare in different scenarios. Because, you know, even with the strongest transport authorities in the land, they don't have complete control of the way society is changing and the megatrends that are kind of buffeting us at the moment.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks.
Glenn, I wanted to ask you about the sort of, you know, the transport planning profession, because it is a profession. It's got at least one professional body, probably more. And if there are any transport planners on the call, I'd love a question from yourselves about what you think about this. But does the transport planning profession get that it's kind of in the dark ages still and needs to revolutionise how it's approaching this stuff? And is it or not? Like, why isn't the industry taking a strong lead on this, or is it? And I'm just not in touch.
Yeah, great question, Claire. I think, well, again, I come back to the diffusion of innovation and the fact that this is not revolutionary. It takes time, and I do think DfT has a difficult task. It's the custodian of the orthodoxy, but it also can set a lead for change, fundamental change in the sector. And I believe in certain respects it's really trying to do that, but walking a tightrope, if you like, in order to do so. In fact, you mentioned CIHT. When we came back from New Zealand, we had a great initiative called CIHT Futures, where we were socialising this idea of decide and provide around the UK. And overwhelmingly, professionals were saying, yes, we recognise the uncertainty, and yes, we recognise that we should be moving more towards decide and provide and away from the current approach, which was very strongly predict and provide. However, what we also heard from those people was that, yes, individually, I feel that, you know, my bones, this isn't the right approach anymore. But when I look at my role with my employer or in my local authority, the system's stacked against me. If I'm stood up at a public inquiry, how am I possibly going to be able to make my case on a decide and provide basis when there's such an ingrained orthodoxy around, you know, evidence equals truth? And in fact, TRICS itself has been used in a predict and provide way. And I'm very grateful that TRICS consortium has, in a sense, seen the light and recognised that its valuable data set of trip rates associated with developments can be used very differently in a decide and provide paradigm. So I think the appetite is there, but it's a difficult transition that we're all in, coupled with a difficult world, of course.
I mean, I kind of get frustrated when I see job descriptions for heads of highways and kind of, you know, these should be people who are being asked to lead change. And when I read them, they don't seem to be. I've got a couple of questions from the chat, which I'll ask you, Glenn. So one was from Ruth, which is essentially, I think, if I've got this wrong, Ruth, to come in, but I think the question is effectively, could predict and provide work if you kind of set the predictions on what the future data you want is? So if you said, well, we need, you know, 30% fewer people using cars and X number more walking and cycling, could that not work? Because that's not happening either, is it?
I think, I mean, Rob touched upon this, and I made the point in my presentation, this isn't necessarily a case that the two paradigms are mutually exclusive. And, you know, in fact, when I was in New Zealand, the New Zealand government's national policy statement said, let's be clear, we're not doing predict and provide. We are building more roads because we want to induce traffic to create more economic activity. That's vision-led. We want more economic growth. That's why we're building roads. I think things have changed somewhat since then. What I would say is one of the reasons that predict and provide is floundering now is that, you know, it's fool's paradise to try and predict when we're in such a state of flux societally, and indeed where, you know, we're facing the climate emergency. And so in that context, what we might see is that we start to stabilise into what might be a new regime, if you like, for transport itself, transport and society, where, you know, areas around the world, certainly around the UK, recognise that they need to do what Edinburgh's doing, that it's absolutely normal to see growth in walking and cycling. And because that infrastructure is getting overwhelmed, of course, we're now predicting how much more of that infrastructure we need to get more of the same. And of course, that's what we saw with the car, you know, the car dependent paradigm that we've lived our lives in, all of us, over the last few decades, is that it was a more of the same approach, which is why prediction was so compelling.
Madeline, would you like to come in?
Oh yeah, sorry, that just made me laugh because I was inspecting a recently developed active travel route, and they told me they weren't expecting much traffic on it, and I just thought, how have we started with a low ambition like that? It's amazing. Right, I just wanted to ask, I think I read an introduction to the talk that you were going to give that referenced that this is how they do it in Germany and the Netherlands. Is that right?
I'm not sure I read that, so it doesn't ring bells. But I mean, I have to say the Netherlands, and actually more so in the water sector than the transport sector, but they are pioneering adaptive planning, and this is, you know, I think another dimension that we tend to have one-shot planning, or we have had in the UK, where, you know, we've crunched our models, we've determined that this meets the requirements of a cost-benefit analysis in the appraisal, and we sink that resource into creating a new asset, and, you know, we're tied to it. Whereas adaptive planning, of course, is saying we have to be more agile in the face of uncertainty. And the beauty, of course, of active travel and related softer measures is that you can be, as again we saw in the pandemic, much more agile. You can put things in, you can take them out in ways that you couldn't possibly do with a major new road bridge or tunnel, for example.
Thank you. Madeline, does that cover your point?
Yeah, I was in the Netherlands last year, and I was amazed by how completely plastic it seemed like we are very individualistic in the UK, and Dutch people are very similar in that same behaviour. But the thing of being plastic in your infrastructure and making driving plasticity in behaviour seemed to be much more in the power of the Dutch government than it was in the British attitude to it. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. Although, as you were talking, Madeline, I could almost hear Tom Van Vuren in my ear, reminding us that, you know, the irony of the wonders of Dutch cycling and active travel infrastructure is also they've got very high levels of high car dependence. It's just that they've somehow captured an intensity of everything in a small country that's heavily populated. But yeah, I think there are those differences, but it's clear. I mentioned the International Transport Forum. You know, of course, all parts of the world are grappling with how do we reconcile, on the one hand, the need to decarbonise, which is a very vision-led, decision-based approach to planning, with the uncertainty, or whether it's economic, political, or technological, that's going to be affecting how on earth we get to a decarbonised future. So there is international interest in this change, and I think that hopefully gives confidence that there's a learning by doing culture now evolving within transport planning internationally, and hopefully there will be momentum increase with that.
Brilliant. Bryn, did I see you had a question? If so, we will finish with your question.
It was, sorry, it's probably the end of the conversation now, so maybe not the best, but it was really just to comment on this issue that perhaps we've been led to this point by the understanding or the paradigm that mobility, increased mobility per se, whatever it was the key to growth and the key to wealth and spreading. But my experience of having tried to work in accessibility to services is that's very difficult to be able to convince people to take that on, because it's so complex. And so those people that are involved in delivering transport are uneager to get involved in that, because they will say to you, but it depends where you put the hospitals. And those that are involved in the hospitals are saying kind of the opposite. And I wonder whether that's sorry, this is really not coherent, but at the basis of why we need a new approach, because we know that can no longer work, and that what we need to do is to focus on what we want out of our spaces, and that transport is only a means to an end in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've very aptly focused on the challenge of whichever transport planning paradigm we have. The reality is that we are in a very complex world, which isn't as straightforward as more transport is the answer to ensure economic, social, and environmental well-being. And you know, again, what the pandemic has amplified, obviously affecting different people in different ways, is that we really do have a triple access system. We were living in a triple access system all along, and it's intensified even more in terms of digital connectivity now. For the work I did for the International Transport Forum, looking at some of their data, World Bank data, if you look across several OECD countries, what you see is that the traffic intensity of economic activity has been going down, and it's coincident with the rise of internet access within societies around the world. So that's why I've emphasised in Decide and Provide that it's access economy coupling that really matters. And as I'm sure people on this call recognise well, if you've got you know, really strong proximity-based planning, then you get agglomeration benefits, you get placemaking rather than thoroughfares for motorised traffic, and all those fears that shopkeepers have that, you know, we're going to lose trade are actually countered by stronger footfall and benefits coming from it economically.
Brilliant. I thought that was a great point, Bryn. You know, that question actually, you know, is the problem here that we're linking economic growth to help moving people around. Thank you, Glenn. I think it would be great if just as we wrap up, to hand back to you to show the Mentimeter maybe, and just any final thoughts on what that tells us. And while Glenn's popping that up, there we go.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for everyone for sharing your thoughts there. I'll take that away, and I'll include it in the slides, Claire, which I'm happy to share afterwards. And I'm pleased to see some skepticism within there, perhaps either in terms of the concept or its deliverability. But I think we've got an exciting decade ahead where, you know, coming back to the presentation for Edinburgh, we can hope to see greater change. And if we don't, we're going to have some very red-faced authorities that are having to explain why they're either rescinding their climate emergency or failing to deliver on the pledges they made against it.
Thank you so much. Right, that's all for this week.